So thank you all for coming. We're really, really excited for our speaker. And also we have some guests with us to introduce the speakers and call to action. So I'm just going to get right into it. Anika Kandavali is going to give a brief introduction to Mike Wara. She is a rising senior at Fremont High School and a member of the Silicon Valley Youth Climate Action Team. She's a passionate and ambitious advocate for environmental causes and urban integration. She has worked with her local Sunnyvale team to better her city and has assisted in teaching climate change-focused lesson plans to her peers in her school district. Back in 2019, she helped organize the San Jose climate strike. She is a committed member of the robotics team and competes in speech competitions regularly. An amateur photographer, she enjoys capturing happy moments with her friends of wildlife during quiet walks around the bay. So I'll hand it over to you, Anika.
Thank you for pronouncing my name correctly, by the way. All right, let me introduce our speaker today, Michael Wara. Dr. Michael Wara is a lawyer and a scholar focused on climate and energy policy. Wara is the director of the Climate and Energy Policy Program and a senior research scholar at the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment, where he provides fact-based, bipartisan technical and legal assistance to policymakers engaged in the development of novel climate and energy law and regulation. He also facilitates the connection of Stanford faculty with cutting-edge policy debates on climate and energy, leveraging Stanford's energy and climate expertise to craft real-world solutions to these challenges. Wara's legal and policy scholarship focuses on wildfire, carbon pricing, energy innovation, and regulated industry. He collaborates with economists, engineers, and scientists in research on the design and evaluation of technical and regulatory solutions to climate and energy challenges. He is also an expert on international environmental law, with a particular focus on the ozone and climate treaty regime. Wara was appointed in 2019 to the California Wildfire Commission, which made recommendations to the state on better managing utility-caused wildfires, and currently serves on the California Catastrophe Response Council, the oversight board on the Wildfire Fund. Prior to joining Woods, Wara was an associate professor at Stanford Law School and an associate in Holland and Knight's government practice. He received his JD from Stanford Law School and his PhD in ocean sciences from the University of California at Santa Cruz. Wara?
Thank you so much for that introduction, Anika. That was great. I should just add one other thing to my introduction, which is that I had the pleasure of taking first-year torts from Michelle Dauber, who's in the audience. I think it was her first year as a teacher when I was in her class, and it's something that I always remember and actually really cherish as an experience in law school and part of becoming a lawyer. So I'm going to talk today about the wildfire challenge and try to connect it to issues of climate justice and social justice in California. And I hope that maybe by the end of this, you'll see that actually there really are some pretty clear connections there and a clear line of sight to connecting the. Oh, let me just let people in. How do I do that with the little bar in the way? Just a second. Admit. Some pretty clear connections to understanding how we think about, the challenge is going to be here that it's hard to share a screen and admit people as they, there, that's working. Never mind. I've been involved in wildfire issues as a climate scientist for about 25 years. And then since 2017, pretty actively engaged in state policy. And I should say what I'm going to say tonight is really just my own personal opinion and doesn't reflect in particular the views of the Catastrophe Council, which is a oversight board that governs kind of wildfire insurance for utilities in the state of California, or of course the Woods Institute in Stanford. So I think before you can really understand the justice and equity implications of wildfire, you have to kind of rethink what the problem is. And so I'm going to talk about, just for a few minutes, what I view as the wildfire challenge and what it's not. And I think you'll see maybe by the end of this that a lot of what's commonly presented as the wildfire challenge is a little bit of misunderstanding, and is in some way represents the thinking that got us into this problem in the first place. So what is the wildfire challenge? The traditional view of the wildfire challenge kind of looks like this. This is a picture of the rim fire burning in Stanislaus National Forest in 2013. At the time that it occurred, the rim fire was the largest fire in California history. It burned more than 200,000 acres and was a quite devastating fire in the national forest until it reached Yosemite National Park and slowed down when it hit areas that had were actively managed with fire, which Yosemite does, and also hit the granite and slowed down. But it was presented as a really devastating fire. It's worth noting that nobody lives there, and so it burned in timber and forest that some of which had burned about 30 years prior and been replanted very densely to maximize timber production. But not in places where lots of people lived. Luckily, also, the smoke blew to the east instead of blowing into the heavily populated parts of California. This is sort of a similar presentation of that viewpoint. This is a figure that CAL FIRE put together. This was at the end of September of last year, just showing acres burnt, right? And I think there's a connection between thinking about timber and loss of timber and board feet and acres burned. And you can see that from CAL FIRE's perspective, last year was an incredibly bad year. I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that presentation of that view, but this is a particular way of thinking about last year that I really want to call into question. And that's because people don't really care. I think some people care about forests and they care about the ecological health of forests. They may care to some degree in sort of an abstract way that forests maybe can store carbon. A lot of people like me care about being able to go out in nature and enjoy it and interact with it, but they don't necessarily think about nature in terms of acres. But CAL FIRE does. I think this is getting closer to what the wildfire challenge in California really is. This is a picture of Paradise from December of 2018. The Camp Fire, which devastated Paradise, burned down half of the homes there, occurred in October of 2018. So this is sort of an aftermath, and you can see just devastation, right? This, every home leveled and a community destroyed, right? Kids who went to school together scattered to the winds because their school was destroyed, because their homes were destroyed. The community really torn apart. And the thing to remember about Paradise is that all those people had to go somewhere in California, right? And even in 2018 and 2019, there was a housing crisis, even in places like Chico, which is just down the hill from Paradise. And so if you run the clock forward a few years, and Chico has one of the largest homeless problems in California. It's so bad that it has completely transformed the politics of the place. Chico used to be run by a progressive Democratic city council. They were booted and replaced by much more conservative Republicans who basically adopted a law and order anti-homeless platform and were successful because the politics of Chico was transformed by this disaster, that was in part caused by PG&E's negligence, but also caused by the fact that the environment in which Paradise was built was incredibly flammable, right? So that a spark thrown into a tinderbox created a catastrophe. This is the case to this day. Through the pandemic, Chico has been incredibly harsh to the homeless, many of whom are refugees from Paradise, many of whom were displaced by refugees from Paradise who bid up the price of housing in Chico. And so, I think one of the ways to think about wildfire is that where it occurs, it really complicates the housing crisis that is at the heart of so many equity challenges in California, right? If you go to the wine country today, 4 years after the devastating fires of 2017, you see that, many of the low and moderate income people who used to live there have been displaced because rents have been bid up, because people who lost homes and had insurance, right? So relatively affluent people get part of the insurance settlement when you lose a home due to fire is 2 years of free rent from your insurance company. And the victims, the fire victims, took that money and they bid up the price of rental housing in the entire wine country because there were so many homes lost. And the housing market is so tight to start with in California that when these kinds of fires occur that destroy lots of housing, they really exacerbate the housing crisis in a way that is incredibly inequitable. And that can even change the politics of the place, as has occurred in Chico. We all remember the scenes from the Walmart parking lot and all the generosity in the early days after the Camp Fire, but that wore out. And what happened instead was what we see here. The situation in Chico has gotten so bad that the city is under an injunction from the district court in California because they're out of compliance with recent Supreme Court precedent, which says you can't make it illegal to be homeless, right? If you don't have adequate shelter beds, you cannot criminalize homelessness in your jurisdiction. But Chico is doing exactly that, and they're trying to in every way they can figure it out. So one way that wildfire supercharges equity problems in California is through the housing impacts that it has and that it has had. We're losing about 11,000 structures a year due to wildfire. We only build 70,000. So we cannot afford to be losing structures at this scale. And when we lose them due to wildfire, the impacts are concentrated. So they make the equity impacts even more intense. So what's another part of the wildfire challenge that I think is really important and under discussed? This is a picture from September. You probably all remember these days in the early part of September. I think this might be September 9th or 10th, looking across the bridge, the Bay Bridge into the city, and that terrible orange light. I mean, I still remember waking my kids up and getting them ready for their Zoom school. And before I took them out of their rooms, before I raised their curtains, just letting them know it's okay. Everything's going to be okay. The world is going to look really weird today, but it's okay. And the thing is, I could say that to them because they're safe and they're affluent. And frankly, we dropped $1,000 on air filters at the beginning of this wildfire season because I knew what was coming. And we live in a relatively new home that has tight seals on the doors and windows, so we can actually clean the air inside our house. But the reality for most people, especially low-income Californians, especially Californians that live in older housing stock or that have to work outside, is that this air kills. This is deadly air. This is poisonous air. This just shows you a picture of the air quality on September 14th. And you can see that this is really a West-wide problem. This is 50 million people on the West Coast of California, Oregon, and Washington being dosed with air that is nothing short of toxic. Marshall Burke and I took the data from the EPA air monitors and estimated, based on the census tracts around the air monitors, how many senior citizens were likely killed by the wildfire smoke. And our best guess, using the calibrations developed by EPA for ambient air quality standards, is that 1,200 senior citizens were killed by acute exposure to the PM 2.5 that's shown on this image, and that ultimately 3,600 died on the West Coast, just because they were breathing air that was so thick with particles that the odds of an out-of-hospital cardiac arrest or severe lung complications is doubled or tripled during these periods of time. The other population that's really at risk are kids. And part of this map, if you know where the southern San Joaquin Valley is, it's sort of in the bottom of this map, down at the bottom of California. It's got the dirtiest air in the country. A third of the kids in the southern San Joaquin Valley have asthma and go to school with asthma inhalers in their backpacks. And those kids present at the emergency room when you get smoke impacts like this, with acute asthma attack. The third population that I'm actually really concerned about are the unborn. It turns out that we have pretty strong evidence from PM exposure, sort of acute PM exposure on the East Coast, when there used to be a lot more coal-fired power plants. You can see we've done a pretty good job, not a perfect job, but a pretty good job cleaning up our coal-fired power plants. You can see that on this map. But we know that much more modest exposure to particulate matter than is evident in this picture leads to miscarriage rates that are substantially higher. And I would just say that, we're actually working on a paper looking at the data from the Stanford healthcare system right now, and very similar patterns are evident in the month after September 9th, which is when the Orange Day happened, where we see significantly elevated miscarriage rates for women admitted to the ER who are pregnant, who come in with, knowing something is wrong, and women know, right? And when something is not right with their baby, and the miscarriage rates are significantly elevated, and I think that's likely to be a major concern. It would certainly be a major concern for me moving forward, were my wife considering having another child during wildfire season in California. So how does this raise equity questions? Well, I think I sort of outlined them. Who works outside? Who lives in older housing stock? Who lives in areas with already chronically poor air quality, say near a refinery or near the centers of oil production in California, in Kern County, in the Southern San Joaquin Valley? Low income people of color, right? And those are the people that are most impacted by the wildfire challenge and the downwind smoke impacts. And I think one of the things that our group is really working to change is the perception that is kind of created by the CAL FIRE presentation of the world, that wildfires happen where there are lots, the impacts of wildfire are limited to the acres that burn, or maybe the communities immediately adjacent to the acres that burn. But the reality that we live in today in California is that some of the largest impacts are far downwind from wherever the fire actually occurs, and that those impacts may be more severe. The one study that's been done to look at the economic impacts of morbidity and mortality associated with a recent wildfire season, was done for 2018 by scientists at UC Irvine. And they estimate that the morbidity and mortality, the sickness and death associated with the wildfire smoke, cost $31 billion in losses in 2018 for California. So I'll just show one more figure about particulate matter, PM 2.5, which are the tiny little particles that are so small that you breathe them in and they actually get through your lungs into your bloodstream, right? That's what this PM 2.5 is. And you can see that on these figures, figure G shows this is from a paper that Marshall and I wrote together with some other co-authors. This incredible trend starting in about 2000, where particulate matter is falling, and the different gray lines there are different regions of the United States. And there's a pattern in that data right up until about 2015 for the entire country. And then the West and the Northwest diverge. And the pattern is one of improved health for all Americans. PM 2.5 is the most deadly air pollutant by far, right? So that downward trajectory is longer lives, healthier lives, kids that don't have inhalers, seniors that don't die of heart attacks for some unexplained reason, but too soon in their lives. And it's being reversed in the West and the Northwest. And we show using a model that the reason that trend is reversing is smoke. It's wildfire smoke. And so wildfire smoke is really undoing a lot of the air pollution gains, the biggest environmental gains that we've made in the United States, at least in this region of the country that we all happen to live in. So if air pollution has inequitable impacts, and we all know it does, right? That's why environmental justice is such a serious concern. This is going to magnify it. And so we need to really be asking, okay, so like, what do we do about it? I'd argue that the traditional priorities on wildfire are pretty far out of whack. The U.S. Forest Service and many of the private entities that own timber tend to focus on timber and the value of timber being extracted and the jobs that are created when timber harvest occurs. And, I think it's good to just like step back for a second and say, well, how much money is that really? In 2018, U.S. Forest Service and BLM, the two primary owners of the federal estate that's subject to timber harvesting, you don't really go harvest timber in a national park or wilderness area. They earned $267 million from their timber sales. They would argue, using a bunch of kind of economic models, that the overall U.S. impact was maybe a couple $2 billion, maybe a factor of 10 larger than that. Let's give them that. Let's just say all the multipliers are, as they say, $2 billion. The value of the smoke morbidity and mortality, as I mentioned, in California alone in 2018 was $31 billion, right? So factor of 10 to 20 different, maybe a factor of 100 if you don't believe their multipliers. And I think many economists would look at them and think they're a little optimistic, maybe. So I would argue that we need to really be pivoting and thinking about our natural lands in a very different way than we have really since the post-war era. It was really in the 1940s and 50s and 60s that timber harvest on Forest Service lands really took off to meet the construction needs in the United States. We've really pivoted from using the federal estate, the federal lands, as a main source of timber harvest for lots of reasons, mostly because we cut down the really easy to get high quality timber, but also because of endangered species and because of international competition. But so what are we doing here? How are we managing this land? Well, I think we need to take a very different perspective and ask ourselves, if we want to solve for the wildfire problem, we need to be thinking about investment in our community, in our homes, our communities, and in the land itself. And I'm just going to talk through three kind of key areas that are incredibly important for solving for the housing issue and the smoke issues. And those are the two that I think are important. I'm happy to take questions about other priorities as well as we get to Q&A. So one thing that we all need to do is harden homes. If you live in a place like I do, in the wildland urban interface, so-called, which is just, where the woods meet houses and they kind of intermingle together, you need to have a home that's resistant to ignition and a particular kind of ignition. You can see here, this is a wind tunnel that the insurance industry burns houses down in. And you can see there's a little pipe and it's shooting embers at the houses. And on the left-hand side is a traditional house with wood shingles and a bunch of other features. They're kind of normal, old-fashioned house type features. And on the right-hand side is a house that's built with ignition-resistant siding, without a lot of mulch going right up to the foundation, and with windows that are resistant to breaking so that the fire can't get inside the house. And one thing we've learned from the last few years of unfortunate loss experience, right, since 2017, is that homes that are built like the house on the right don't burn down in wildfires. They do, well, that's not fair. They do burn down, but they burn down about half as much. So if you look at the experience in Paradise during the campfire, only, I believe it was 29% of the homes that were not built to what's called the WUI code, the Wildland Urban Interface building code. Only 29% survived, the ones that were not built that way. The ones that were built, that were hardened for wildfire, about 55% survived. So it's not like it's 100% guarantee, but even in fire conditions as intense as the campfire, there's a dramatic difference in the survival. And what that means, if you can build houses like that, they not only provide protection to themselves, but they protect the house next door. Because one of the things that leads to the loss of one home is the home next door igniting and then showering its neighbors with embers and sparks and heat. So one thing we really need to look at, and this is really West-wide, not just, in California, we have a good building code for new houses, but we have many homes that were built prior to the advent of that building code that are basically tinder boxes. And where those exist in hazardous, places that have a chance of a wildfire occurring, we need to figure out a way to harden them. And the goal needs to be something like herd immunity, right? Where we vaccinated the houses against wildfire. And that doesn't mean that the vaccine is perfect and that no house will burn down. Some houses will burn down, but a lot fewer will burn down. And we'll avoid things like what happened in Coffee Park in Santa Rosa in 2017. Another thing that needs to happen is we need to start thinking more at the community level about how to protect ourselves from fire. Very little of this goes on in California or the West, unfortunately. There are a few kind of standout communities. Big Bear is one of them. These are pictures from Montecito, which is obviously a very affluent community, but one that decided to invest in community level fire protection. And the basic way that has been shown to be, or the way to do it effectively, is to hire people who go out in the community, build the trust, build knowledge so that folks in the community understand what needs to happen to create defensibility, and then help do the work, facilitate the work getting done. And that means resources, it means coordination across jurisdictions, right? Private landowner next to state, next to federal lands. It means a whole bunch of things, but where this has happened, these are images of Montecito prior to the Thomas Fire. Thomas Fire burned up to Montecito at very high intensity and just stopped, and they lost 3 structures. Now, subsequent to the fire, there was a terrible mudslide that occurred, and they lost a bunch more houses, and also I think 25 people died. So this doesn't guarantee safety, but it did protect the community from the fire. And if we can do this in more communities, I think we'll see a lot less structure loss, community disruption, and impacts that propagate through the housing market, even to people whose homes didn't burn down. So another thing, and this is sort of wrapping back to another piece of the climate justice, is to really think differently about fire itself. So this is a picture from a fire called the Creek Fire. And you may have heard about the Creek Fire. You may have seen it on the news because it created some very photogenic images of National Guard helicopters whisking people away to safety when the tourists were entrapped, encircled by fire at Shaver Lake in the Southern Sierra last year. And the Air National Guard, the Air National Guard had to fly in with Chinook helicopters and rescue everybody. The reason that they could do that is that the area around Shaver Lake is owned by Southern California Edison. And for the last 30 years or so, Edison has been actively burning the landscape. They try to burn every acre that they own about once every 5 to 10 years. And the reason they do that is that they, about 30 or 40 years ago, came to realize that that was the way to protect their infrastructure and the workers and the communities that depend on the infrastructure. So this is a picture of the Creek Fire when it hit the Edison lands. And you can see that all the trees are alive, and basically the surface of the forest floor burned, but that the trees survived. This fire burned up to the Edison lands at what, the description that the folks that fought the fire give is sort of that it was a little bit like a fire bombing more than normal forest fire. The rest of the landscape, the Forest Service owned landscape, looks like burnt toothpicks, where it's completely black, and they're just the individual trunks of the trees left standing that'll all have to, they'll fall down or be cut down. It's not clear which yet, but it's a stark contrast to this. And the fact is that the fire basically steered around Shaver Lake, largely because the area around it had been heavily treated with what many people call in the business called good fire, right? Prescribed fire that was designed to mimic what Native Americans did prior to European conquest of California, or really even actually they did it even later than that. Prior to the gold rush, when the population of California skyrocketed and the state of California basically hired vigilante gangs to run around shooting Native Americans in California in the 1850s through the 1870s. And what you see in the area around us, if you go and look at, for instance, for example, at Big Basin trees, the redwoods that exist in Big Basin that are old growth, they have burn scars every 5 to 7 years up until about 1850. And then there are no more burn scars until the fires from last year. And what happened is we removed Native Americans from the landscape. Native Americans played an incredibly important role in creating a landscape that was resilient to wildfire. And of course, natural causes also start fire. Lightning, as we learned last year, unfortunately, starts wildfires. But it's really important to recognize that the ecosystems that we have in California depended on natives burning the landscape in a very regular way. And that, almost more than fire suppression, more than firefighting, is the biggest change, the biggest intervention that we made that's led to a kind of buildup of fuels that is creating the tinderbox, where then climate change provides conditions for that to blow up. So Native Americans, this is Elizabeth Azus, who is a Yurok tribe member from Northern California. The Yuroks and the Karuk especially are some of the most active cultural burners, and they're trying to restore their land management practices to the areas both that they currently control on their reservations, and also beyond that through agreements with federal and state landowners and some private landowners. And the thing is that burning the land creates safety. It's good fire. It creates much less smoke than it does create some smoke, but if the assumption is instead that a wildfire might occur on a September or October day with catastrophic consequences, the comparison to that counterfactual is one where a natural fire regime involving people burning the land in careful, measured ways is much safer, both from a community protection perspective and also from a downwind smoke and health impact perspective. So how do we get there, right? Like, how would we get back to a landscape that looks like that, where the native peoples, or at least their practices, are returned to the land? And I think, one of the things that the challenge of wildfire really calls into question are some of our views about nature that really date back to Muir, pictured on the right here, as opposed to the Awanichi woman here, working in Yosemite Valley, probably gathering acorns. The Awanichi, just like other native tribes, they're Paiutes that eventually were run out of Yosemite National Park and were made refugees in the Eastern Sierra by Mona Lake. They actively burned the landscape for lots of reasons, partly to make the hazel that you can see. The woman there in the picture has a beautiful basket on her back. And when you burn patches of hazel with prescribed fire or cultural fire, hazel grows back in a way that's better for basket weaving. And that's one of the reasons that native tribes burned. They also burned because it produces a healthier and more robust acorn crop, which is important for them, but it's also important for all the animals that live and depend on acorns as a food source. So one of the things I think that we need to think about is how the perspective about nature as a place where people are not is incorporated into our laws, and where that comes from. And part of where that comes from is John Muir. The Sierra Club has really forthrightly acknowledged this, that John Muir, he did a lot of good things, but he had a perspective about native peoples that essentially erased them, and did not view their presence as a positive for the environment didn't understand the role that they played in shaping the Sierra that meant so much to him. And then he worked so hard to preserve. So part of what I would argue we need to be thinking about it, and I should just say, like, that attitude, that perspective about nature as a place where people are not, is very much a part of our legal relationship with nature, both in terms of the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, the Wilderness Act, many of the laws that govern federal land management. And we need to really be questioning that and thinking about, if we're going to deal with the wildfire challenge, both the kind of, community level safety, but also the downwind smoke impacts. We need to be asking, like, how do we empower actors on the land that will return it to something like the way that Native Americans managed and maintained it prior to about 1850. And, I think personally, the best way to do that is to let the Native Americans do it, to empower them, to give them greater control over the landscape than they have had in the last 170 years. And, there are great examples of this sort of thing starting to happen in Canada under the Trudeau administration. And I think it's a model that we can really follow, where, essentially the equivalent of national forests are being returned, at least in a limited way, to the management of the tribes that whose territory they historically were. And it's an acknowledgement of the theft that occurred as well when we federalized all of that land.
Hey, Mike, can you excuse me for a second? Sudi, can you please mute yourself? You're not muted, and it's making it hard to hear the speaker. Thank you. Sudi?
Can I mute Sudi, maybe?
Yeah, you can.
Let me find her. Mute. Oh, maybe that just worked. Okay.
Thank you.
So, I think we do need to think in a fundamental way about changing our legal relationship with nature. This is just a picture of what the Creek Fire blowup looked like on the day when it made a 10-mile run down the canyon toward Shaver Lake. And you can see it was a 50,000-foot tall pyrocumulus cloud from aircraft. It looked a lot like a nuclear bomb had gone off. It was a devastating and really tremendous fire. And it's a fire that was precipitated in important ways by climate change. The tree kill that really facilitated it happened during the last 5-year drought. But it was also precipitated by a century or more of land management that first, the forcible removal of Native Americans, and then fire suppression and the view of fire as an enemy rather than as something that needs to be managed. And managed in a way that's consistent with what ecosystems need to thrive. So, what are the key kind of, legal relationships with nature that I think are a stepping stone to resilience? One is really thinking about NEPA, that our environmental assessment laws, in a different way when it comes to fire. Fire in Sierra Forest is about as natural as rain in Sierra Forest. It's meant to happen. The forests need it, but our environmental laws treat it as an aberration when someone would go to set a safe and prescribed fire, that they have to do a complicated environmental permitting. If a wildfire occurs, well, that's an act of God. The Clean Air Act allows wildfire influenced data like PM 2.5 data that exceeds health standards to be stripped out for compliance, but requires an air permit if you want to do a prescribed fire or a cultural burn. And the federal land managers tend to view fire as threatening because they are focused on maximizing timber outside of parks and wilderness. And I just say lastly, I think there's just a clear in the current moment especially for tribes that really want to do this, to restore their historic relationship with the landscape that they lived on for millennia. I think there's a clear rationale for creating an opportunity, at least, for tribes to step up and to provide them with resources if they need resources to practice the prescribed fire and cultural burning practices that they did for millennia until white Americans ran them off the land. So just in conclusion, I would say we need to be focused on people's lungs and homes, not acres burned. We need to invest in our landscape. This is not cheap. This is not going to be cheap. I think the one way to think about this is to ask, how much do we spend on putting fires out in California? Last year, it was about $4 billion. Last few years, closer to $2.5 billion a year is the Cal Fire budget. We need to be spending about that much on risk reduction at the landscape scale, both hardening homes, protecting communities, and also really changing the fuels environment in our forests so that when they are ignited by some stupid hunter or someone with a flat tire throwing sparks into dry grass on a hot summer day, we don't end up with a cataclysm. We end up with a fire that is suppressible and that we can manage for hopefully for the benefit of the forests and the animals that depend upon the forests. So we need to invest. And I also think we need to really, and I think that investment will reduce the inequitable impacts that we're seeing in California already because of the sort of climate change charged wildfire seasons that we're observing. And it'll protect people's lungs. It'll protect people's houses who are already struggling to keep that housing over their head. And in doing that, I think if we can take a hard look at the structural racism that's inherent in our environmental and land management laws, we can also do much to remedy what is the kind of, we just celebrated Juneteenth, and I think that day and what it means and the slavery and the incredible injustice that our country perpetrated, that's our original sin perhaps, but as much, and particularly in California, our original sin where we live here was what we did to Native American people. And those people are still around. Their tribes are here, they exist, and they really want to, in a fundamental way, many of the tribe members that I speak with and interact with really do want to have a legal pathway and the resources to what the Bill Tripp of the Karuk tribes always says is to give gifts to nature so that nature can give gifts in return. Thanks, and I'm happy to take questions. I guess there may be some in the chat. Let's see.
Yeah, and also we have another leader from the Silicon Valley Youth Climate Action Group. It's my pleasure I get a highlighter. She's going to help facilitate the conversation. She co-created the climate curriculum that has been used to educate over 8,000 high schoolers, and she has advocated for policies. So, Radhika.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to be moderating the Q&A, and I just think that was a wonderful presentation. I personally learned a lot, so thank you so much for that. And I also want to apologize in advance if I mispronounce anyone's name in this Q&A. So the first question is by Michelle, asking if the downward trajectory, I believe in the PM 2.5 graph, is due to lessening of coal use.
That's exactly, it's due to two things, Michelle. The phase out of coal and the requirements that EPA made on coal plants to install scrubbers. It's also due to improvements in the way that we clean up diesel emissions from big trucks. And maybe the only good thing that the Bush administration, the second Bush administration, George W. did environmentally during his tenure was to phase in ultra low sulfur diesel, which allowed for catalytic converters on big diesel vehicles. And those two things, the scrubbers on coal and cleaner diesel, are the reason for that downward trend.
Awesome, thank you for that. The second question in the chat is by Linda. What are some ways have education and some incentives that have helped homeowners to harden their homes community protection, and are Native Americans working with state government agencies, etc.?
The incentives to I think we don't have enough and incentives to create defensible space and hardened homes. There is theoretically like a legal obligation that the fire department could come and declare your home a nuisance if you haven't maintained it in a way that's safe for wildfire. But the reality is that they don't. And most homeowners really don't have strong incentives. And I think we need to change that. And I would say there needs to be, probably we need to lead with carrots here more than sticks. That we need to provide resources, especially to low-income and moderate-income Californians, to help them make these changes. Because, I mean, we had to cut down a tree in our front yard when we moved in, and it cost $2,500 to cut down one tree. It's a very expensive process. Putting a new roof on your house is very expensive. But if your roof is a wood shingle roof, your house is a bomb sitting in the middle of your neighborhood. And one of the most effective things that a community could do to create safety, I think Big Bear might have done this, is to go in and just replace the roofs that are going to ignite in a fire. Tribes are working more with the state of California and with the federal government, but I'd say that it's mixed, and we need to do more to meet them where they are, and to help them. The tribes that I work with are, I would say, if they had to say where they're getting the most support, it's from big philanthropy. Honestly, they have sort of figured out a way into getting grants from philanthropic organizations that are helping them to scale their cultural fire practices.
Awesome. Our next question, Bruce, would you like to unmute and say your question?
Sure. When I say air quality index, most everybody knows what that means. And that's based on modeling, and it's particular to your own little block. And I'm wondering if it would be useful to have a wildfire index that uses modeling of wildfire propagation and weather and humidity and so forth, to create an index that's telling the likelihood of a wildfire today that could be in my neighborhood, as a way of making it real to people so they don't live in denial.
Yeah. Bruce, it's a really good point. There are such indexes. One that I follow really closely is something called energy release component, which basically just says kind of how much energy will a system release if it's ignited. And the reason that varies in a particular spot is that for a fire to burn, it has to evaporate all the water before it can burn. And that takes a lot of energy. And so if an area is really wet, it doesn't want to burn. And intuitively, we know this, right? It's like hard to set a fire with wet wood. But that's actually measured in a systematic way by the fire agencies. I think it's not well understood. Another one that I think people need to start paying closer attention to is something called vapor pressure deficit. It's not a very intuitively appealing term, but if there's one measure that tracks the kind of intensification of wildfire seasons that we've seen over the past few years, it is vapor pressure deficit. And it's basically how dry is the atmosphere, right? How much drier, what is the difference between what the atmosphere actually is holding in terms of water vapor and what it could hold given the temperature of the air? And the bigger that difference gets, the more the air is going to tend to pull water out of the vegetation. And that deficit of water vapor is driving a lot of the changes that we're seeing in fire behavior, but also in terms of how much water ends up in reservoirs, right? Like the Colorado River, the reality is in the basin now, a lot less of the rain and snow that falls down on the area that drains to the Colorado actually gets into Colorado, because it evaporates on the landscape before it ever gets there, because the air is thirstier than it used to be. So maybe a better way to put it would be like, how thirsty is the air? And climate change is making the air in the West very thirsty. And that leads to all kinds of problems.
Thank you for that. Our next question is in the chat from A. Patrick. He asks if you have any specific suggestions for how to reform the CAA to facilitate more managed burns.
So Patrick is asking about the Clean Air Act. And actually, I ran a whole class about this last quarter. So my students came up with a whole bunch of suggestions. I think the most important one would be to move toward a system of permitting for prescribed fire that looks a little bit like the way that we handle dust and sort of dirt that would wash down into a storm sewer. The way that works is that a county applies to the EPA for a permit to manage its stormwater sewers. And what that permit says is, when you build a house, you got to put the little hay bales, the straw bales around the construction site so that sediment doesn't run off the construction site. And when you design a parking lot, you have to design it in a particular way to minimize impacts to the storm sewers. And it's basically a set of best management practices. And you have to file a notice with the county when you start to do any of these things. But essentially, the permit is called a regional permit or an area-wide permit. We need to move away from a situation where every air district has to sign off on every prescribed fire that's like 5 acres or 2 acres or 10 acres, because we need to get to a situation where we're burning in California, hundreds of thousands, maybe to 1 million acres per year, if we're really going to get a handle on the wildfire problem and restore something like a natural pre-US, pre-conquest fire regime for the state. And that fire regime, at least our modeling suggests, would be much better from an air quality perspective than what we're experiencing right now. But so moving toward these kind of more automatic, permits, I think would be an important first step.
All right, and we're moving to the last question as of now. Oh, no, not the second to last question now, from Anika. Would grouping support of displaced persons without insurance after these fires, would this risk management portion of the budget be viable?
Anika, that's a really good question. So when I was on the Wildfire Commission, one of the things I had to work on was kind of like utility stuff, but another piece was insurance. And I worked with Dave Jones, who was the insurance commissioner at the time, on a report on what we could do to make the insurance situation in California work better, especially for renters and low-income people. And one of the things that we thought about was how much would it really cost to just have some sort of an automatic payment of, say, $50,000 for people that are displaced by a natural disaster in California. And actually, it's not all that expensive. Like it's an amount of money. It sounds like, wow, it's a lot, but in a context where someone loses everything, they are uninsured, they don't have any kind of primary homeowners insurance or renters insurance, I think it would be a really impactful intervention that would act to really stabilize the least well off in our community. And that's an idea that hasn't gone anywhere, but I think we should be considering. And it is better than providing insurance subsidies like what we do for flood in the United States, where we basically we sell below cost flood insurance to anybody who wants to live in an area that may flood. And what that does is mostly benefit rich people who want to live on the beach. And if we instead focused on kind of means testing and providing us a benefit that would sort of get back on your feet benefit for folks that are displaced by a natural disaster, I think we could do a lot to help and to help those people recover and recover their lives. But it's not something that the country, historically has really done in sort of an automatic way, where if you're displaced, you get the money, you get it quickly so that, your kids can get back in school and you can find a new place to live and keep your job, hopefully, all these things that are disrupted when you lose housing.
Thank you. And our next question is by Michelle. Would you like to mute yourself and say your question?
Hey, I actually had the same question as Linda that's in the chat about what legislation at the state level do you think would be most helpful? And vis-a-vis helping people harden their homes, I wonder if you saw John Oliver last night about
No.
some of the, yeah, it's about the sort of scammy programs that, I forget what it's called, but the governmental program that helps low-income people make energy efficient or whatever modifications to their homes, and how it has resulted in a lot of people like taking out, tax liens on their homes, losing their homes. So I think we obviously have to be careful about what solutions we propose, that might help people to do some of these things, and how we collectivize some of this risk rather than individualize it and then hand it off to private interests. That have a profit motive. But that said, with that caveat that we have to be careful, what could we do as an action item to take, what can we support that will help the most as we head into this sure to be disastrous fire season?
Yeah. Well, so one thing I'd say is that the state is moving in a pretty positive direction. Like the budget around wildfire is really shifting. This year, for the first time, we're going to spend more than $1 billion as a state on risk reduction actions related to wildfire. And a lot of that is going to be spent, out in the woods doing prescribed fire, building community fire breaks. A tiny sliver of it, because of the concerns that you raised, Michelle, is going to be spent on developing a pilot home hardening program where they're going to test ideas about how to avoid. I mean, this issue around fraud is a huge one. And it's all different kinds of fraud, right? It's contractor fraud. It's like people gold plating their house when they say, oh, we're home hardening, and then they put in really fancy windows or something for their home hardening intervention and bill the state for it. All kinds of things can happen. And so developing a program that works and doesn't result in unintended negative outcomes is really important. We do have a model that works pretty well at a relatively small scale in the Bolt and Brace program that the Earthquake Authority runs in California. And that seems to be working pretty well. And they figured out ways to manage these sort of fraud issues. They have not yet really figured out a way to address equity. And so there's not a kind of means testing element to that would make it entirely free to earthquake retrofit your home if you're low income. But they're working on that. But I think the model of kind of going, starting and learning and being very attuned to those issues is incredibly important. I actually think where we need to see the biggest help is in Washington right now. The Forest Service just proposed its 2022 fiscal year budget. And frankly, it is a missed opportunity. The Forest Service owns 57% of the forested land in California. So if they don't do something about this, there is no way that California solves this problem. I am no fan of our former president, but when he came to California and he said, they need to rake the forest more, right? He was wrong, because it's not them, it's the federal government that needs to do better forest management. And he was wrong about the raking. It has nothing to do with a rake, probably has more to do with a drip torch than anything else. But he was onto something, right? And the people the culture that really needs to change is the federal, the BLM and the Forest Service in terms of how they approach managing the lands that they control, so that they are not a hazard to everyone living around them, right? So that they're not, in legal terms, a public nuisance. Now they're immune to they have, sovereign immunity to a public nuisance claim, but that nevertheless, the way that they maintain their land is interfering with everyone else's use and enjoyment of their lands. And that's kind of the definition of like what a public nuisance is. And what's disappointing is that the Forest Service recently proposed a budget where they basically are proposing more of the same. And I think what everyone could do that would be most impactful is to call their representatives, to call Senator Padilla, to call Senator Feinstein. Senator Feinstein is a co-sponsor of a bill that's pretty good. It's a prescribed fire bill written by herself and Senator Wyden and a number of others. It's probably about a factor of 5 too small in terms of its spending, but it's like headed in the right direction, at least. And I think this stuff changes over years. It doesn't change overnight, but we need to now is a moment at the federal level where change is possible. We have a new administration. They care deeply about equity and justice and environmental justice. And the Forest Service is kind of like trying to play it cool and maybe slip under the radar. And we need to make sure that doesn't happen as a state because too much is riding on it. I think CAL FIRE and the Department of Natural Resources and the other state agencies that have a lot of responsibility for this, they are doing, it is an all hands on deck moment for them. They recognize, the governor recognizes that his political future may depend on how he handles this, and nothing focuses the attention of a politician like when their future might depend on how they handle something. And so he and his staff have worked really hard. You can't turn a situation like this around in a year or even 2 years, but they are moving, the ship is turning, at least at the state level. But where I worry is the feds. And I think we just need to speak up, because California has a loud voice in Congress, and California has a loud voice in the administration, and we can make change. But it's just going to require everybody kind of in a concerted way saying, what was okay, maybe a little bit annoying in the 1970s and 80s is just totally unacceptable at this point, because it's going to make this place that generates so much wealth for the country unlivable. And so we got to do something different. And I think we can make that argument pretty convincingly.
So that's really good. Maybe after the meeting, you can circle back and give us the bill number of Senator Feinstein's bill so that we can organize people to call and support that bill. And also, I just wanted to say to when you get home, or I guess you are home, watch the John Oliver episode from last night. The program is called PACE, and I assume that is the program that would be used to do some of this house hardening. And it is basically about how it's a giant fraud shit show. So just
PACE has been problematic. Let's just put it that way. Yeah.
Yes. Humorously problematic if you watch John Oliver, but yes, problematic.
All right, since we are a bit over time, I think we're gonna end the Q&A now, but thank you everyone for your wonderful questions and for Mr. Wara for answering to them.
Thanks so much for having me, and for everyone coming and listening tonight. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you all. We are a few minutes after 8, but we do have a quick call to action from Linda Sell, who's here with us. And she, for a long time, has led our environmental committee. She's a fierce advocate for policies, both locally and at the state level, and a mentor to a lot of rising climate activists. So Linda, do you want to present our call to action?
Sure. So over a year ago, the Silicon Valley Democratic Club approved a letter, and the letter was related to the Lehigh cement plant, which is locally one of the largest greenhouse gas emitters in Santa Clara County. Besides that, is they have a proposal to hugely expand. So the Silicon Valley Democratic Club had a letter, and recently the medical association supported the objections to expansion, and tomorrow there's going to be a hearing on it. So Silicon Valley Democratic Club led the way on that issue. In a similar issue, there's a Stevens Creek quarry, which is also going to intensify its operations. For some reason, it's going to take material from the Lehigh cement plant, and it could be like 1,300 trucks a day, in the heart of Silicon Valley, just outside of Cupertino. So the letter that I'm proposing, which you can share the letter. Is this, which just simply ask for the Planning Commission to not waive SVYCA for this plan. SVYCA is the California Environmental Quality Act, so it should go through SVYCA. It should see if what are the impacts and what are remedies to the impacts that this plan could propose, and also what they plan to do is change the zoning so that they could do this new accepting of imports from Lehigh, and that wasn't their original intent. So their current permit shouldn't be allowed to utilize that. And I was just referencing in the paragraph, that this intensification, up to 1,300 truck trips per day, in a highly residential area, could have a lot of safety concerns for many neighborhoods. And then the Santa Clara Medical Association related to Lehigh cement plant expansion with 666 trucks, then 1,300 trucks additionally from the Stevens Creek quarry would be, even more of a concern. And even that, with the 666 trucks, the Santa Clara Medical Association said, that could lead to excess deaths, disability due to cancer, lung, cardiovascular disease, as well as heightened traffic concerns. So I'd like for the Silicon Valley Democratic Club to support this letter, which, just calls out that this highly intensified industrial expansion of the Stevens Creek quarry should not be allowed in this highly residential area because of safety concerns. And, definitely it needs to go through SVYCA review. So that's basically the letter. And Silicon Valley Democratic Club, one of the largest in the region, has a lot of say, and it was the impetus for the county Democratic Party to support the last letter a year ago related to this issue. So, and the county has a big say. The supervisors are taking action, and so your actions will lead to more positive actions. That was it.
Is a motion in order, Jenny, to send this letter? I move that we adopt Linda's recommendation and approve this letter and send it.
I second the motion. Is there any discussion? And we could just do a verbal vote. Let me see if I can. So all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any opposed?
Perfect.
All right.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for.
The Silicon Valley Democratic Club will lead the way on this issue too.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you getting in the weeds and bringing us such great actions for us to work on with you. So thank you. And so that wraps up our meeting. I hope that you'll all join us at our next meeting on July 19th at 7 p.m. We will be discussing how the pandemic has disproportionately impacted women. And we will have Dr. Salz, who's a national leader in diversity, inclusion, and equity, who will be leading that discussion.
Anyway,
So we hope you can join then. And with that, the meeting's adjourned. You're welcome to stay for a few minutes if you have want to have any further discussion.
Jenny, do you think it would be appropriate for us to send Mike like a nice thank you card or something like that? I feel like his presentation was so good and it was so professional. And I mean, we get a lot of good presentations, but I thought that was one of the better ones we've ever had. Unfortunately, so poorly attended. So do you think it would be reasonable for us to, we have so much money right now, like to send a little like thank you gift or something like for,
Yeah,
or is that-
definitely. He also
Yeah.
was like letting people in during his presentation.
I know. Like maybe we could send him like just a little like some like a fire extinguisher. Yeah, like a home fire extinguisher. That's what Ken said.
Oh my
But
God.
you know, like I don't know, like a blue bottle coffee gift, you know, bag. That's my favorite thing, but or something, some little token item that we could. I think the
Yes.
fire extinguisher is actually pretty funny.
Yeah. I kind of want to do that. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
it'd be great to get back in the habit of making sure we follow up with their speakers and
Give them some appreciation
Yeah.
if they've gone above and beyond at least. And I thought that was, and Argamon's presentation next month will probably be above and beyond as well. So we're really lucky, I guess, by virtue and part of my job that we have access to these great speakers, and we should make sure they feel appreciated.
Yep. Agreed.
Yeah, since we don't offer an honorarium or anything. But that was a great meeting. I learned a ton. I learned that my vacation home is probably about to be reduced to rubble. That's what I learned.
All right.
It's bad up there.
Okay, well, thanks everyone. Have a good evening.
Good night. Thanks, Jenny. Bye.